I see that's so much better. There it is.
I know people from NGRP respond to because I know things change.
Yeah, that's my favorite. Hi, how are y'all? Welcome. I'm Professor Hill. I teach graduate classes here in Seattle studios, and I teach parametrics and graduate fabrication. Every once in a while, I will teach undergrad areas class 325 or 225. Next quarter, I'm teaching 225. And so been asked to kind of talk through VRAY, how we use VRAY and how to render, right? And so before we get started, I got one running in the background here. We're gonna go through the model. We'll talk about the model. I'm gonna use VRAY solely based in Rhino today, but the premise of this is that it actually works the same inside of the other programs as well as SketchUp or even inside of Revit. So before we get started though, I want to go around and see who you are. I know some of you. Add some of you. I have some of you currently. And I want to hear your backgrounds, you know, architecture, where you're at the program, and what you're looking to get out of today. So, Joanna, you're right up front. Introduce yourself. This is like, hey, stand up. I'm Joanna. I'm your recovering architect. Okay.
My name is Joanna. Programs first year. I graduated from SCAD in 2019. I worked for 3 years on that. And I'm trying to learn from there. I get used to it before I was never really, continue. And
It is very different than what it was a few years ago.
Because I've only used it right now.
Yeah.
And I don't even use right now that much. So. But yeah, so I'm trying to learn a little bit more now. Take as many resources as I can.
Yeah, cool. All right, then we'll just go row for row and go back.
Hi everyone, my name is Denzel. I'm in Mark first year. I graduated in 2020 and now I'm back again. So I'm actually here. I'm interested to learn more about VRAY. So yeah, that's all.
So,
My name is Cedric. I'm a freshman here at SCAD. I'm in the IPOP program. And I don't know how to use any of the architecture programs.
Perfect.
Except I messed around with SketchUp a little bit.
well, there's no better place to start than right now.
It'll be new experience.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah. I'm in college and it's also my first year as a medical student. I'm also minoring in business and I've never used any of this.
Awesome. Don't worry. This is going to be like the nuts and bolts of how to start. Okay. So.
Hello everyone, I'm Monica and I'm a senior this year. I don't really use VRAY. I'm going to admit it, I've used every other load rendering software, Landscape, Neon, everything else but the so I'm super excited.
I'm Liz, I'm a senior and I've never used VRAY, but I always want to learn how to use it. So I'm excited to learn, at least just how to do it up. If I do know
Perfect. We'll start with square one then. Okay.
So I'm Zach, and I've used VRAY a little bit before, but it crashed. So I used it. And I used it with SketchUp. It looked nice for about 3 seconds.
Before I quit.
I'm interested in learning more now. That's okay.
Awesome.
Hi Jay, I'm a junior.
Sweet. Sweet. I love it. So we'll try to keep this down. I know one thing that does happen, I'm gonna try to close out some other stuff here, is that sometimes Zoom and VRAY don't play very kindly together. And so because they both actually run off your graphics card. So that's one of the things to keep in mind. So in terms of what VRAY is, let's talk about what VRAY is before we actually start opening up. So VRAY is a render engine, and it's based off of the company Chaos. And VRAY's been around for, I don't know, let's think, when was the first time I used it? In 2007. Okay, so it's been around as long as there's been Rhino, there has been VRAY. Now the older version was a lot different than what it is today. It was a lot more based in like you applied materials, you built materials, and then you rendered it out. It was strictly a render engine. So it means that you would build your model, you'd apply materialities to it, and then VRAY would need to then build light hashes, and it would understand like how render engines work is they understand principles of properties, right? So we look across at the museum over here, and we look at the way the sun comes over the top of our building and casts a shadow along one edge, but then reflects off the top of the other. What's actually happening is light is bouncing off of that surface and reflecting back to us. So render engines like VRAY actually are based on that principle of light refraction. So it reads how a color would come if the light bounced off of it and how it returned back to us. And so that's also one of the reasons that it is one of the premier programs. It's been around for so long. There's other render engines that exist. Some of those things are like 3ds Max, right? I personally don't care for 3ds Max because you have to learn a whole other program. I'd rather render out of the models I'm building, and that's why I like VRAY. The other ones are things like Lumion and Enscape. In this last year, Chaos Group just purchased Enscape, so now it's basically one program. So VRAY owns Enscape, which is great for both. It means that there's a progressive render engine that lives inside of VRAY that's now going to be based in the Enscape. It means that they have all the families and pieces that you can use interchangeably. And we'll talk a little bit about those too, and the difference between a progressive renderer or interactive renderer. An interactive renderer is one that, if you're familiar with Enscape or any of those render tools, it interacts. So basically you leave it, and as you're modeling, it'll just render and keep getting finer and finer the longer you set. A progressive renderer is the one that you have to you're going through the school, for those that are new, and you're going on computers, and it says, please don't log me out, I'm rendering. So a progressive renderer is actually running in the background behind that Word document, and it's actually filtering, and it goes through, this engine in particular uses your graphics card. So it uses all of your processing, your GPU units, like, you say a 32 gigs of, graphics, 32 gig graphics card. It uses each one of those GPUs to then render. And that's a bucket that shows on here in a progressive form. Interactive will just continually run all together. So, so that's kind of the basics of what the tool is. Right now I have a few windows open. I have the actual VRAY assets right here. I have my actual render frame, and then I have my model itself. So let's talk a little bit about the model and how, oops, don't cancel that. I made that today. Let's not lose it. Okay, so let's talk about how, first off, to set up your file. So I set up a quick little model here for us to review, and I added a few different parts and pieces to it. Now this is Rhino, for those that are new, right? For those that have not now, I think Rhino tends to be the go-to when it comes to developing projects, especially for school that are conceptualized. That's a lot more freedom and flexibility. I made this model, this whole thing, with all of the structure and everything in it. I made it about 30 minutes.
Yeah. Is your parametrics class also in Rhino?
Yes.
I want to learn Rhino.
Yes, it is. It is. Well, I use the Rhino inside, and then I use the Rhino. So there's regular Rhino and Grasshopper, but it becomes a fairly easy tool. Now, what you've noticed, we might notice inside of my model, is I have different colors for different things, right? So the reason I do this is when you set up your model for the first time, what makes it really helpful is to actually not place materials on an object, okay? So there's two ways to place materials inside of your models when you're working. One, I can actually select the surface. I can go to surface, I can go to the properties, and then I have a whole list of properties here. One of those is materials, and I can actually apply a material to an object that I select. That is one way to do it. I would tell you, for me personally, I would say that's the wrong way. Let me tell you why. And the reason is that once you do that and you get into more complex buildings, you now have to be responsible to place the material on every one of those objects. And every time it changes, you have to go back and replace them over and over and over again.
It's like Lumina.
It's like Lumion, right? Now, the other way to place materials in an object is you can actually place them based on layering. So you can assign a layer to have a certain material finish. That's how I tend to do my modeling. So you can see here in my layers on the side of my screen here, layer 1, that is the actual structure of my building. It is not those trees. Those trees have a map on them because they are an asset, and I'll show you how assets work. Those should actually be white. I'm gonna change those really quickly. Okay. And turn off my entourage. So here I have my little space frame structure. Okay. And now each of these will just become this material right here, the steel brushed 5 centimeter skin. Okay. The next layer I have in here is my canopy or my canvas. I ended up selecting a plastic type finish, so it had that slick look, like it was like a stretched canvas type structure. Okay. The next one I have is my actual grass, or yep. Why I didn't make grass green, I don't know. It's a weird thing I just decided to do in the moment. So whereas my concrete is actually the green portion, I don't know. It was in heat of passion. I have no understanding for why I did it. The next is going to be what I call my entourage layer. Usually what I'll also do in here is I'll go through and I'll label these things so that I know what those materials are as I'm getting set up to render. So that way, as it's really clear what pieces are. Now, entourage, the reason I call it entourage and I don't give it a specific thing is that inside of these tools that we use for rendering, you have assets. Assets are pre-built models that already have maps built on top of them. Oftentimes, there are things that are called object files. So like in this one, it's a mesh file. You can see it's a tree with all these bits and pieces. Well, it already actually has a map, this map that's placed on top to make it look a certain way. And so the entourage becomes those pieces that you don't want to mess with their finish. You want them just to be whatever they are. And so that would be things that oftentimes support your modeling. Also, it's nice to have an entourage layer because when you're working on your projects, you don't necessarily want to always have plans with people in them, right? So it's really easy to come back into your model in the process and then turn off your entourage to see just the plan. Most of the time, I will have an entourage layer and I'll have a plants layer so that my plants live there, because sometimes your plants, you want to see the trees, right? You want to see those outlines of trees. You don't want to necessarily see the people or cars or things like that. And so the next one is going to be the canopy itself. And then it's going to be the structure. Okay, and then I have my default layer, which is like my base layer. This is usually the layer that I use to build everything on top of. Something else I do inside of my tools as I'm working is I'm notorious for building copies of copies. So as I'm working on one piece, I will go like this, select it all, copy, and pull my copy over here. And that way I have a copy and a saved version of it as I'm working. What that really does for me in terms of process is then I'm able, one, to see my process as I'm going. And if I go down the wrong rabbit hole as I'm designing, I can always come back to what I just had.
Has that ever happened? Probably not, right?
I've done, yes, I've done it in terms of ideation. So if I've like changed the way like my building form looks and I've ideated another form, then I'm left with like two strings, right? It's like this version and that version. And then I'm able to show my client, well, do you like option A or do you like option B, right? Do you want this one or that one? And so I have, mostly my files just become really big. So eventually, every once in a while, as I move through project phase, I will save my file. I'll save it to a number or a date, clean everything out of it and say, this is where we're starting from here. And I'll just scrap whatever else was left. That way I have a backup of the original. And when it comes to rendering, you want to be cautious of how many things you have in your file, because it will affect how it renders and how the output comes. And that's something just to keep in mind in general, because you will be surprised. Just make sure that we don't have anybody in here yet. Yep. Okay. You'll be surprised about how heavy the model gets, because as it's trying to render, it's trying to process all the geometry and all the things. So something for that to keep in mind in your modeling before you start to render is think of the scene you're building, not the entire project. Right? I never build models to to the max. So like if I was going to render, like in the case of this, I've set up a couple scenes for us to look at. If I was setting up a scene here, I wouldn't necessarily go and put benches and people along this back corner. The reason being is that I can't see them, right? So I build to the scene that I'm rendering. In that case, my file size is smaller. That then, so when it renders, it actually takes less time. Because when the render engine runs with higher geometry, it tries to read everything else in the whole entire model. So the smaller the file size, the faster the model will actually render, or the lower the process points are. The other thing that I do, if you noticed inside of my Rhino, is that I do create scenes, right? So I create a saved view of a rendering. Now, the reason I do that is who's ever done a rendering? Y'all render? Who's ever done a rendering and not saved your scene and then you turn your model and then you have to make updates to your model? That's a really bad day, right? So if you save the scenes themselves, it gives me the chance that if I'm like working on stuff and I forget and I don't have the render, I can just double click back on the scene and I'm right back to where my view was. And it lets me render directly out the same way at the same scale. Because the other part about this is your workflow, right? So as you render, I never actually leave my renders right out of VRAY or out of Enscape. I always take them in Photoshop and then add Photoshop layers on top. And so if you can continue the same scene every single time, those Photoshop layers you already built, you just slide the new image in the background and it's all better, it's all fixed. So it actually helps you in that process time so you're not doing it over and over again. Just a quick thing, in order to make scenes inside of Rhino, it's actually really easy. So you have the named views here. If that's not showing up, you can click on the little wheel and you can scroll down to named views and turn it on. And then you just have to hit, like I can turn this one and we can pick a different scene and make our own scene here. Okay, and all I have to do is hit save as scene 3 or whatever you want to call it. Now I have a third scene in that view. So I can go between each one of these and I can now render all 3 of them independently. Okay. Now I have a working layer on, so I want to make sure that I turn that working layer off before I render so I don't get the double skin. That working layer was really just for me. And what it actually does, just so you guys can see, I know this looks like a crazy model and you're like, how did you build that in 30 minutes? I cheated, honestly. Let me show you how I cheated real quick. So I have a plugin called, we use Grasshopper, which is a parametric plugin. And there's a plugin for Grasshopper called Lunchbox. And all I need to do is I need 2 surfaces. And then I can actually create a space frame between 2 surfaces. And that's all it takes. And I'm done. And so it looks crazy, but it's not that crazy, right?
I did something like that on Revit. I had
You
to.
built a custom node family,
Yeah.
and then you built a surface, and then you repeated the surface.
Yeah.
Terrible.
It already put it.
Yeah.
It had the full shape, and then it put it on there. It worked, it just like was kind of.
Doesn't work as good. Yeah. So this works really clean, right? And each one of these actually controls different parts of it. So here's my surfaces that I have, the top and the bottom. This is actually my UV map, and this is good to talk about because rendering engines actually use what's called a UV map, right? Is everyone familiar with an X and Y, XY grid, right? So if we're looking at an XY grid, it goes like this, right? Y in that direction, X in that direction. Well, in Rhino and 3D models, we have 3 directions, right? Because we also have a Z direction, one going up. Well, the thing about mapping inside of render engines is they don't work that way. It works in UV, okay? And UV is the breakdown of a surface in terms of panels. So if I have a surface that looks like this, and I have one that looks like this, it's smaller. If I have a UV of 4, it's actually the same size. The map is the same way. You've probably noticed that if you've ever rendered anything, and the texture on one side comes out massive, and the texture on the other one comes out tiny, it's because it actually maps exactly the same size, even though it's a different surface. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. That's why the UV becomes part of this, and that's just the division of the surface, how we break the surface up. But UVs are not based on size; they're based on scale. So it's always relatable to the actual surface itself and proportion, not based on the size of the surface itself. Okay. And that's usually one of the things that that's actually in terms of rendering, that's probably what gets people the most. is they just kind of like apply material around an entire building, but their panel sizes and their sheet size, all of their surfaces are different sizes, and they can't figure out why this one's small and that one's big and this one's big. And that's the whole reason behind it, is that each UV map is actually different. So making sure that the surface has been broken down proportionally will actually solve some of those conditions. And one of the ways that you can actually proportionally change files or projects inside of Rhino specifically, and I'll show you really quickly what this might look like, is I'm gonna have a surface here, okay? And I'm gonna copy it. And I'm gonna rebuild it. So you can just use the rebuild command. Now it's gonna give me this map, and this map's gonna tell me that I can rebuild it to 5 and 5 with a degree of 4. Now, the degrees in the UV map are actually the distance between the panels. So a 5 is how many points are going across the surface. The degree is where that starts. So if I do a degree that's one step down, I'm actually going to shift the end over. If I do it, if I'm doing one step, like if it's a 5, 5, 4, 4, it's going to be an even proportion across the edges. Okay. So I'm just going to show you what an even proportion looks like. I'm going to say, okay. And I'm going to turn on my points right here. So you can see here's my points that go across that surface. Each one of these is part of that UV map. So I have U and V.
So the map resets every point, I mean, as you go.
Yeah, so if I turn this one on, I have one surface.
So it would just be like,
One giant panel. Okay, if I make a copy of that, oops, and we're gonna make it, if I go rebuild that one again, and I turn it down to like 3 and 3, oops, and then I turn on my points, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, because I have 1, 2, 3 points across each side. Okay, so, and now if I do a half step on that, so I change my degrees, I'm going to go rebuild. And I'm going to change it to 4, 4 with a step, 2 steps between it. I'm going to turn on those points. It actually shifts. So I have 4 points, but now it actually shifts over. So it's a half cell on 1. Okay. So you want to be mindful of how you set up your mapping, because sometimes the mapping wants to be this way, right? You have that half of a piece that way near the other half as it goes. Okay. But that's in terms of understanding mapping of surfaces, this becomes really a bigger part of how we understand. So all modeling programs will use a mapped surface in some way. Revit does a UV map, SketchUp does a UV map, Rhino does a UV map, but seeing how they work. Now, part of this tool is also understanding the programs themselves. And so before I kind of go on to talk to you a little bit about the 3 types of programs that we use in modeling. One is what we call a tin-based modeler, a triangulated interfacing network. Okay, and that would be SketchUp. SketchUp is a triangulated interfacing network. For those that have used SketchUp before, if you make a sphere, it has a whole bunch of little triangles on it, right? Because that's how they make surfaces. Revit is a BIM-based model, so building information model, which means it's a buildup of components that are placed together into surfaces and objects. Rhino is what's called a NURB-based modeler, and that stands for non-uniform rational B-spline. That'll be on the test later, so don't forget that one. And a non-uniform rational B-spline actually is based not in points and facets, but in anchor points. So like if I was to take this surface here, where I have a point right now, everything is flat, and I was to select that point and pull it up and deform the surface, you see it has a little angles there pulling it down. So those angles, this is actually a knot. And it's like pulling against the surface, and that's the response back. So a non-uniform rational B-spline uses a spline condition, which is very similar to how boats were constructed way back when. Because when you build a boat and you build the hull of a boat, you would actually build pegs on the outside of it, and then you hook on to the boat and then pull it tight, and that's what bend the curve. So the further out you pull, the further you pull the material. So that's something to keep in mind too. Your modeling is that this point knot is not the height of the material, it's actually how far away it's pulled. So it's the tension between it. But just to see how the model materials work, Rhino is going to give you oftentimes a lot smoother surfaces than SketchUp or than Revit would give you often. And so that's why I tend to be more into the Rhino world when I'm modeling, especially in school projects. Is there any questions so far? Okay,
Do I have to print this running with all the figures then?
yes, you do. Okay, so let's jump in now to the actual tool itself. So VRAY is a plugin for each one of these tools. If you're using VRAY for the first time, if you open up the school computers, it's going to pop up and have all these little tabs. There's actually only one of them that you need to keep, and that's this one. It's VRAY All, and all the things live on it all together. Okay. If it doesn't show up, what you actually have to do is you need to go into your VRAY here, or into your panels, and then you can turn on, or sorry, you edit curve mesh tools. It should automatically upload. If it doesn't, if it's not showing up, you can come back to here and you can click on all the options along this point. If it's not showing up along the side, you can click here and then say show toolbars, and then you're able to go scroll down, find the VRAY toolbars and turn them on and off from here. Okay. Inside of this toolbar, you're going to see a few things. You're going to have first right here is the asset editor. So this is how we build materials. This is how we adjust the actual render engine itself to turn the outputs and make them what we want them to be. The next is going to be our Chaos Cosmos, really crazy names. This is actually the asset browser. So this is where things live, like people and trees and benches and all sorts of stuff to populate your projects. I highly encourage you to get familiar with this. I would tell you that there's a difference between a flat rendering and a live rendering just by the placement of trees and people inside of a scene. It'll change the way people perceive it, and you'll see it as more real and invested. The next is going to be your the render. Renderers always look like a little teapot. I've never understood why it's a teapot. It used to be that when you would actually open up the tools, it would actually map every surface onto a teapot. So I think it just stayed that way. But the teapot is where you start. The next is interactive rendering. So interactive rendering is where the scene will continually render in the background without you doing anything to it. I don't like to use that on VRAY because it eats up a lot of memory. I'll tend to use that for progressive rendering, as I mentioned, and we'll look at that. You're also going to have your VRAY vision. So this is going to show you some of the bits and pieces that live there. You can also render to the cloud. So Chaos has a render cloud that you can send your renders out, and they'll render them for you and send them back to you when they're done. That does cost, so just depending. But in terms of practice, sometimes we do that because it might not be that expensive for us to get them out. You're going to see your batch render panel. This is going to show you, you can set up multiple renderings at the same time. So if you have lots of scenes, you can actually set them so you can render each scene and it'll render them all together for you. So like in our case, we have 3 different scenes already set up, and we can just run them and let them process. You also here have your frame buffer. So your frame buffer is that frame you saw at the beginning here. That's the scene of which everything is rendering for you in the background. Then you have your light gene window. So this is going to show you your lights and how the light works inside of here. You can actually download functional lights into your models so that you can bring them in and they'll apply. The next ones of these are going to be parts of the project itself. So you have rectangular light tools. So if you're building surfaces and you want to do like a night rendering, you can actually place lights in your model. The one I'll use the most of is this one right here. It's called a point light tool, or sorry, no, this one right here. It's an open source sun creation or a sun path. No, it is this one. It's a point light. So this is like a little sphere you can drop in the middle of a space and like illuminate a whole room without putting it in a light, right? These other ones I'll actually use to build them into lights themselves. So like this rectangular linear light we have here, we could use one of these rectangular light tools and align it across the entire light. It'll have a direct light out of that box directly on the surfaces. So setting up lights becomes a little tricky because you have to understand the principles of light decay and how lights function. I tend to not use them very often. I'll usually Photoshop that stuff in later.
Do you use the studio lights? What do you call those?
The little point lights.
Yeah.
I'll use the point lights, and I will sometimes. I've used the linears when we did some feature walls and projects because we wanted to show like how the light was washing along the bottom of the wall or up on the ceiling, and it did work out pretty well. But I will model the fixture, and then I'll use a material that's called an illuminated material, so it'll look like it's glowing. And then I can just make it pretend like that, right? You see a lens blur on there, but I can actually render the scene without putting lights in there yet. The next are going to be like your dome lights, and this is like how you build a big sphere around them. You have open source suns, and then you have directional lighting tools to find which way the sun's coming. This one right here is an infinite plane. So this will actually give you, say you're modeling inside of Rhino without a box, like I built a little base here. This tool will actually give you a plane so that your model will live on a surface. So you don't have to go ahead and make a box underneath it. I like the little box because you can make it kind of look like it's a floating little model inside of it. That's just a preference. You can export scenes as VR meshes. So this is how if you create some sort of object that you want to make into an asset, you can actually export it out as a mesh. And it'll have all the material properties to it, like a bench or something, that you can then bring it in through your asset manager, through your chaos browser, and then drop it back into your project later. This is how you import those meshes or those scenes. We also can add fur to things. Fur in these terms. I'm going to show you how to make fur. Right? What can you think of that? Why would we need to have fur? What has fur? A sofa might have fur. Think outside. An animal, in case you're remembering a bear. You never know yours. No. So like grass is a great example, right? Grass textures will always show up flat, but we know grass isn't flat, right? Grass has a furring to it. So you can actually add the furring into your model so it has a little texture to it.
And then put the grass texture on the fur.
And then you put the grass texture on the fur, and then it looks like grass. Like so it comes up and has little fuzzy bits to it. I'll show you what happens when your grass is too long and you have to trim it. But we'll talk about that. And the next is going to be the clipping plane. So you can actually create sectional models in VRAY and render section models. You also have the displacement properties, which lets you kind of displace objects inside of it. Scatter, decals. Decals are like surface skin. So say you have like a big wall graphic, or you're doing some project that has like, like a super graphic on the wall. You can actually build it as a decal. It'll place it on the wall flat, and then it becomes a rendered part of your model. You also have edit in VRAY, so you can actually select certain objects, and you can say edit in VRAY, and then it'll let you pick that thing, and then you can change it. We also have modified camera tilts or set camera location or focus, and then we can lock current views. So that's the basics. So let's go ahead and open up the VRAY asset tool. So VRAY asset editor is right here. This is where everything kind of lives in terms of your model. Now I have a bunch of things in my model because I've been placing things for our lecture today, but normally when you open this up, it might open up as empty. If you're opening this on your own computer, you're going to be able to see this entire list of preset materials that live inside of VRAY, which is really helpful. So you'll have things like bricks, right? You can see those bricks in here. You have things like, I can close some of these panels too, so we can see it better. You have all sorts of types of bricks. You have porcelain tile. You have emissive materials. That's what I was talking about with the emissive. So that's like a 5K LED, and so you can actually take this one, place it on a surface like that lens, and it'll glow, right? But it doesn't actually emit light. It just looks like it's emitting light. Because like in here, we don't really see the light burning down, right? Because inside of a darker scene, if you're using just lights, it'll actually have a light decay edge to it. But sometimes light doesn't work that way, and renderings don't feel that way. So you can actually add those emissive materials. You can have fabrics, okay? Even down to drapery-based fabrics. And you saw kind of, as we looked in inside of the modeling tool, you can make fairly soft structures and surfaces in Rhino. So you can actually apply actual fabric bases that'll have the same sort of rhythmic fold to the surface as well, so that it doesn't look like a faceted surface material coming onto it. There's metals, there's liquids. Even in the liquids, you can have things like, we can render the entire ground to be a wave. So it actually has a wavy rolling motion to it, right? Again, all of these things are just about setting a scene, okay? In order, and you can see the whole list of the other ones in here. In order to add a material to your project, all you have to do is either click and drag it into the scene here, and it'll add to that list right there. Once it's added to your list here, what you can actually do is come back into here and say, I wanted to change all of my defaults to be that carbon fiber. I click here on material for the default. I click on the drop down, and you can see there's the carbon right there. Just click on it, push OK. Everything in that material is now carbon fiber, right? Now, let's say, for instance, let's take a look and see what that looks like, because it might look a little funky. I have a good feeling it will. It's going to be really misproportioned. But here's my surface, and let's zoom in on it. Let's say that I render the scene now, okay? I just want to see what it looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize my materials here, and I'm going to open up my rendering settings. So each one of these tabs is a different part of the VRAYs itself. The first is my materials. The next is my actual lights. So any lights that I have in the model, like those rectangular lights, will show up here, and I can make adjustments to them. Then I have my actual objects or my geometry. So these are the people that I have and the trees. You can also see that I have fur right here, right? We're going to talk about furring. And then I have my actual environmental textures. So you can download environmental textures like backgrounds and scenes and pieces like that to have like sky maps and things brought into your model as well. I tend to not do that. I tend to add those inside of Photoshop, and I'll end up using this and exporting a PNG file, right? Everyone's familiar with the PNG. It's an image without a background, right? So then you can just come and slide an image in the back, and I have a whole bunch of textures that I'll use for that. In terms of rendering, though, I have right here, these are my render settings. If I click on this, it's going to open up this entire frame of all of the things that I can do, right? So the first thing you're going to see is I have 3 different options. I have a CPU, a CUDA, and I have RTX. So RTX is my graphics card, and that's going to run specifically off my graphics card. The CPU will run specifically off my CPU. CUDA is actually going to run off my graphics card as well. Now, this is a big change, and you're lucky this has happened, because when I was back in my day, when you had a VRAY only ran off your CPU, right? So if you didn't have enough memory on your CPU, VRAY would crash, right? But for most of the time, like on my laptop, my graphics card's pretty heavy. It can handle a lot of work. And so running off the RTX card is really the best option for me. And that way I can actually keep working on other things on my CPU while my graphics card's running really, really heavy, okay? So, and once you have those set up, you can actually select different options for each of these. And you'll see it slightly change in some of those options that live. So first off, on a CPU, we're gonna have what's called bucket sizes. So when a renderer works in a progressive nature, when it does progressive rendering, okay, it's going to like slowly build and build and build. If you have that turned off, you have buckets, what it's actually going to do is each one of those, in the case of my CPU, I have 32 gigs. It's going to use 1 gig for each thing and then just like process. And so it's all the little squares that show up on a render frame. That's what those buckets, that's a bucket. Okay. And then you can set it up to how it reads. The other things you're going to notice in here is who's a photographer that likes photography. SLR cameras, right? So who's ever used Instagram before? Okay. You've edited images in Instagram, right? You've changed things like exposure. You've changed things like light balance. You've changed things like focal depth. All of those things actually live. It's all camera based, right? A render engine is the same way. It's all based on the functions of a camera. So for those that are really familiar with using a camera, as you scroll through here, you're going to see things like depth of field. How far does my lens read before it gets blurry, right? The other thing you're going to notice in here is on that depth of field is going to be your focal distance. This is like a camera lens, 200 millimeter lens, 50 millimeter lens, right? So that's how you adjust those depths. And how those step is a farther away lens will actually push your image further out. And a shorter lens, like a 50, will bring it in flat. Okay. So if you start to understand these principles and play around with them, you'll start to see how different those frames can be and how you set things up. You then have your effects. The effects can be things like vignetting, right? We all love vignetting on our Instagram page. We're like, vignettes, corners in, nice and dark. Or vertical lens tilt, which gives you that little lens flare coming in the corner. You also can change your outputs, okay? So right now I'm outputting it at 800 by 450 pixel image, which is a 16 by 9 widescreen, okay? You can also animate. So you can set up animation frames inside of VRAY to create videos and film, and it'll render each frame out individually. And then you have your environment, which is going to be your general. Now, the other thing that I really do like about VRAY a lot, and sometimes what I'll use, is you can have material override. So as you're working on your models and getting scenes set up, instead of rendering out everything in texture, you can come into here and say material override and make it all white. And I'll just do that. I'll just go and make everything white. push OK. And now when I render, it's not going to render materials at all. It's only going to render white scenes. Okay. Now, the reason I do that is that when my outputs come out, I can render a lot faster. I can ensure my shadows look right. And then I'm not kind of like fidgeting with little bits and like waiting and fidgeting and waiting. It'll happen a lot faster. The other thing you're gonna see on the bottom of this, which is new to VRAY in the last few years, is a thing called Swarm. And this is mostly for big companies. So I was at Gensler before coming out here to SCAD, and we had this set up. And then what Swarm lets me do is that in a huge network system of all the computers together, I can actually use everyone else's CPUs and GPUs that they're not using at the moment. So I had 1,200 computers in the Southwest region that when I was rendering, I could use all 1,200 computers at the same time. It's like a rendering farm, but it's like a project manager might be only using 2 gigs, 2 CPUs, and they might have an entire GPU that's available and the other 30. Right? So whatever they're not using, it just pulls out and lets you use it. Now, you got to be careful as you get into practice. Be very cautious of how you use this. I got a few calls from LA saying, hey, Mike, you got to tone it down a little bit. Because I was rendering high-def images like instantaneous, and it was just like bogging everybody down. But it was awesome because I was like, I hit the button and I was like, render. And I was like batch rendering. So I rendered like 32 images in like 10 minutes. Everyone else was like, why is my computer so slow? Why it says I'm using CPU space, but I can't figure out why. Yeah, they tracked that one down pretty quick. But it is a really helpful tool as you go in. Now, the other thing you're gonna see on the right side is all of the render parameters. So these are gonna be things like your bucket sizes, how many segments are divided across there, the noise limits, subdivisions of rendering, anti-aliasing, which is how you filter light parameters, color mapping, how the color is reflected back, or your optimizations, which is going to be things like adaptive lights and ray tracing. You'll also have your I have global illumination, so you can actually turn this off and use light frames and not globally illuminate. I'm going to use global illumination just because it gives us an easy output quickly. I also have this set up too on my camera. If you notice, I have auto exposure turned on. So it'll automatically adjust for the exposure. I don't have to deal a lot with the exposure change. You also see that I have a brute force and a light cache. So each of these is a little bit different. So brute force basically forces light onto an object, and a light cache maps it. And how they show up is actually different. So brute force will be like little buckets to show, and the light cache will kind of like fade in and then fade in and then fade in. It's a preference how you set these up. I tend to do my first one as a brute force just to get all the light out there. And then I tend to use light cache on my secondary. So then it kind of like cleans it up as we go. Some people prefer to use light cache or iridescent maps. You can try both and see what you like. This is how that light cache works. It subdivides the entire scene into a number of pieces, and then it shoots off light from there as it builds. Okay. You also have advanced camera parameters like your aperture, going back into our camera, right? So our aperture is the amount of open that the camera is. The more open it is, the more light it lets in. So if you're actually struggling with the exposure, you can adjust the aperture to be bigger, and then the exposure doesn't have to be as high because it'll let more light in terms of that lens. If you're getting overexposed images that are burning out, then you can decrease the aperture, and that way you then adjust your lighting that way. Okay. The other things on here are going to be like volumetric environments. So if they have aerial perspectives, you can go ahead and use suns or kind of define how that happens. Contouring for the models, denoisers. So this removes some of the speckling that happens in the render, and it'll kind of smooth things out. And then you have configurations right here, which are some of the baselines. Okay. Now, as you set up these files, it takes a lot of time, obviously, to get your render right. You can see that from all the things we went through. What's really great that VRAY lets you do is like, once you find something that works, you can go ahead here and say, save rendering style, and it'll export it as a viewport. Now, what's also cool about this is that you can find other people's, and you can share with each other, and you can download and say, hey, I got this really great one that does really cool evening shots. So when I was in school, I have our files are called VSpots. And I have a flash drive with about 60 different render setups that are all named, right? Evening sunset, like white model. And it was great because then we could do really quick renderings. We shared them with each other and we adjusted them. And that just gave us a chance to really hone in those skills. So as you're doing this, like think about that. Like you guys are working on one here, share with each other whichever one, right? It doesn't hurt. You've already built it. And then you can start building that database of tools. It's also great when you go to practice and your boss is like, I need you to do me this rendering really quick. And you're like, no problem. And you pop in your settings, hit the button and render it. And like, here you go. And he's like, oh my gosh, you're doing it. Right? And like, how can I pay you more money? Right? So those types of things do play a big role into this. So keeping that in mind. But let's go ahead and just do a quick rendering of what this looks like with the material as it is. So I'm going to go ahead and use my CPU on this one. I'm going to hit the render. I'm going to open my frame here. And I'm just going to click right here on my little render. This is the progressive, the interactive render, which means that it'll render all the time. And I'll show what that looks like, but I'll do a first start on this one. So this is just going to be that carbon fiber. But you can see like something doesn't look right on this. And the reason it doesn't look right is that my material scale is super off on the surface. See how big those carbon fiber strips are? It's like the largest carbon fiber in the world. This building is like, I built this thing at like 100 feet by 50 feet. So those pieces of carbon fiber are like 18 feet wide. So something it does not seem right, right? So I'm gonna turn on interactive rendering. I'm gonna show you what that does for us. So I can actually just turn my scene and I can zoom in and turn. And what you're gonna notice is that it's gonna turn and adjust with me. So interactive will stay all together, okay? Now, in order to fix this problem, all I have to do is come back into my material list right here, and I can find that carbon fiber. That's what it should look like, those little itty bitty tiny little pieces. Well, the reason it's doing that, remember we talked about at the very beginning that map? Well, because the surface is so big, if I go back and look at my bump maps are how we actually build materials, okay? And surface maps, okay? If I look at the image here, well, there's my bump. But if I go back into my carbon and say, where's my UV placement, right? Well, my UV placement's at 1 to 1. So it means that that material map is actually stretching one whole surface. Well, if I want to change it, then I need to adjust and I need to turn it down. So I'm going to turn it to 10 by 10. So that's going to give me 10 across and 10 over. And let's see what that does for us now. So it's on interactive. And already I'm starting to get closer to what that looks like, right? But that still seems a little bit off. If I zoom in here. Okay, you can see that the interactive rendering too, it slowly gets better and better the longer we let it sit. That's why I also don't like it. It's great to like adjust and flip around scenes to check things, but in terms of actual final product, I rarely ever use it. But I might even still say, you know what, I need to adjust a little more. Actually, I want to take it to like a 15 by 15. Oops, not rotate it. No, thank you. Then I can go back. There we go. Now that starts to look a lot more like a carbon fiber sheet. Now, even in terms of the scale route, it's still a little bit off because it's a fairly big piece, right? Carbon fiber strips are only about that big. So you just want to keep adjusting in these frames. You know, maybe it's more like a 50 by 50. You want to keep adjusting in these frames until you get to a point that's like, there we go. That seems like it, right? That seems a lot closer to what a carbon fiber sheet that big would look like, right? And so part of this is just going through that process of adjusting. Now, let's say you have the same material on multiple things, okay? But one wants to be a bigger grain and one wants to be a smaller. It's really easy. All you have to do is right click here and you can say duplicate. It's going to automatically create a duplicate option for you. Just give it a second. There it is. And now I can go into this one and I can adjust the map on this one to be whatever that one needs to be. And I can apply it to a different set of materials, okay? So now I'm going to take you, we're going to do a quick little look at what it looks like to actually render out a scene from the ones we built. So we went ahead and made this scene here, right? So what I'm going to do though is I'm going to go ahead and turn off this layer and turn on these other ones. Now I'm going to do just the grass and those pieces. I'm going to turn off this other piece here. Before I do, let's talk, actually, before I do that, let's talk about fur and how the grass works. So we're going to see this. This is the interactive. You can see my little grass there. Well, I'm going to make that grass grow. Let's make it nice, big and tall and seem like it's overgrown. Okay. It's going to grow through the concrete even because how it's set up. So, and I'll tell you why that happens. So I'm going to go back to here. I'm going to come into my, my material, my geometries, and right here under fur, I have the grass itself. So what I can do in this, open up this scene so we can see it together. We can watch grass grow. Sounds like a very terrible thing in reality, but this will be fun, right? So we're gonna come up and right now I have 10 pieces per area. So this is as dense as it gets, but my length is really short. It's only 1/4 of an inch, okay? If I start turning that up, it's getting a little woolly and unruly. You can see the grass growing through the concrete. Look, someone needs to mow that freaking thing. Like, where have they been? The forgotten piece of architecture, right? But it does, it really helps, right? Now you see it, it's like you can build a field and put sheep in there. And all of a sudden the sheep are hidden amongst the grass. And what a change in your renderings. Your professors will be like, man, I've always wanted sheep and grass in models. How did you get there? But right now what's actually happening is it's growing through, it's actually growing through the concrete wall. And the reason it's doing that is that material on that piece is actually a block. So if I built it as just a surface, let me show you really quickly. I'm gonna fix it. So I'm gonna take this piece out right here. I'm gonna turn off everything else. Keep just my one layer on. Get rid of the concrete. And I'm gonna say it on this one. I'm gonna say explode. Okay. And I'm gonna go ahead and pull out all of the pieces of this model that I don't need, only the surface. So in terms of context options, surfaces work really, really well when it comes to rendering, because then you're not left with all the other stuff. So now that I have just the grass as a surface, what you're gonna see is if I come back into here, and I go back into my render, no more grass growing out of the wall. Okay, it's all living now inside of that surface only. Now, what's also happening though is that you can also see the pathway though. So you can see where this path lives in that render. See that? I have the concrete and it's growing up around the edges of my model. So now I'm having this like textual feeling of this thing being placed. It's little things in renderings that make the biggest difference, right? So now the next thing we can do in this, maybe we want the grass to be a little bit longer, right? So I'm gonna keep my grass, I'm gonna bring it down a little bit. I'm gonna bring it down to about 6. So that it feels like it has that experience of being kind of overgrown, but not crazy overgrown, like, you know, the wild fields of New Zealand. We were talking about New Zealand earlier, right? Sheep running around. So we're gonna keep it a little bit smaller, but what we're gonna do next is we're gonna add some assets to this. I'm also gonna increase my density count. So count per area, length is gonna come down. So now I'm gonna come into here and open up my chaos browser. These are all people. I've been looking at people. So, but I can go to my 3D models here and I can select everything from furniture to vegetation. So maybe I want to do some flowers and grass and rocks. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and let's add some dandelions to this. You know, why not? Right? Looks like it's overgrown. So we're going to grab this little dandelion file here. I'm going to say download. In fact, if I go back here, I can just click download there. And now I can click on the green thing here and place it. And you can see I have a little tiny dandelion file right there. I can just go ahead and I can place little dandelions all over randomly on that field. Okay. Hit escape to end it. And then if I look back in my progressive render, my poor little grass dandelions are being overtaken by the grass. Maybe we got to shorten it up a little bit more. We'll turn it down to like 1 or 2. See what that does for us. Yeah, we're just laying it out. See if I can find a better view here. Also going to select it, right click, oops. And I'm going to say, oh, you don't do that to me. I got to put it back in the entourage layer, I think, because it's trying to override it by material. So I'm just going to select that surface. I'm going to hide it just really quickly. So standard. There we go. There it is. And turn off the rest of these. There we go. Perfect. Just going to delete those. We don't need those anymore.
Can you set up showcase?
Yes, you can. I don't. I just tend to use the standard issue just because I feel like it's just as easy. I'm gonna change this now from grass. I'm gonna change it into entourage. And that way it shows up as the entourage layer with the other rest of the people and stuff like that. So now it should be able to map a little cleaner. Turn on my layers here, go back to unhide. Right click on that one. It's gonna bring everything back. And I can see my little dandelions right there. If I zoom in here, turn on my view. There he is, there they are. See him? Little itty bitty dandelions growing up in the field, okay? But what's great to know about that though is like, if you wanted to, you could actually scale them up. We can make them like gigantic dandelions too. So we can click over here and make them big and do whatever else we wanted to. So we can do, let's do scale. Click on the bottom, click there. We'll have a massive dandelion. Maybe it's like, you know, maybe the theme is Bug's Life or something like that, right? So super dandelions. Now we need them sheep for real. Okay, I'm gonna bring it right down on that surface though, just until it touches too far, right there. Okay, now let's see what that looks like. Ready? Super dandelions. Okay. So this progressive render though gives you a chance to then see it in action, right? So it's always constantly going. Now, if I want to render that scene though, the scene that we made earlier, I might stop the interactive render. And what I might do is I might go to that scene. I set up all my pieces before. I'm going to move this over just a little bit so we see our dandelion. So I'm going to pan. Don't want to miss the dandelion. That's a big part of the project, right? Going to right click. I'm going to do, I'm going to say save as again, save and say, okay, yes, override. Now it's part of it. Now I'm going to turn off that layer that I don't need anymore. This one up here. So now I have the dandelion, all the pieces and the people. Then I'm going to go back to this view here. Okay. And I'm just gonna, now there's two things you can do inside of this render engine. One up on the top right, you can see the little box. This little box lets me render out just portions of the scene. I'll use this as I'm working on it in depth, so I can really check to see how it's working, okay? So I can go ahead and hit render. It's gonna go ahead and do its thing. I didn't use interactive, I used the progressive one. So you can see in the bottom here, oops. This is where it's gonna kill my computer. There it goes, okay. So there's the progressive render. It tells you what it's doing here. It's right now it's rendering the images. You see all the little boxes, that's my buckets. So each one of those is one of my CPUs. And it's rendering. See that? It's going through the process. Right now my output is on medium. So you can adjust that to like high plus, which is like 4K, right? So you can do really high in-depth renderings. But I'm just gonna let it run, and you can see how quickly, like how nice, and see my grass, right? Grass is kind of flipping up there, has a little shadow that casts across it. If that grass is too much for you, you know how to now trim the grass, right? Super easy, pull it down, make it short. And once you see the scene is where you want it to be, then you can come back and say, you know what, this is actually looking pretty good. And then you stop, take off the box, and then hit render. And now it's going to do the same thing, but instead of doing it for just the one, it's going to do the entire frame for you, right? And you can quickly see, like, this is going to start the process. It's going to take a minute because it has to go through the whole rendering process of doing my lights and then rendering out portions of it. And each one of those CPUs is working. It's also fighting against Zoom. So as you do this yourselves on the SCAD computers or on personal computers, just keep that in mind. You want to have program, you don't want to have programs running that are going to bog it up. If you're running Revit and Rhino and Photoshop because you're trying to be efficient, your computer's going to crash. It's going to tell you that it hates you and doesn't want to play that game anymore. Okay. So we're just going to let it run really quick, and then we'll change it. We'll pull it out, and I'll show you what it looks like when you pull it out. It looks really funny with that dandelion and that guy. Like proportionately, I'm like something is not right.
What did the whiteboard, somebody drew a flower?
Look at that.
It's like
I internalized that happening. Yeah, that was me. That was my flowers. But it's kind of fun to see this guy next to this giant, massive dandelion. But you can see how easy it was to like get to this point, even in terms of the textures of the concrete, right? Like that concrete texture coming across has that depth that we like to feel. But as I mentioned, I'll never leave my renderings here, right? This is the test one, so this is the medium. So the next thing I do is I come back and I turn up I go into my settings. I'll show you where that lives. Right here in assets. Right there, I can go ahead and turn that up to medium, high, ultra high, or medium plus, or high. And then I can change the output so I have a clear, more finished output. Okay. But as it finishes up here, what we're able to then do is we're able to save this file. I'm going to show you two things before we save this one that's pretty cool in terms of VRAY. But you're going to save the file out and then open it up in other pieces and other sources. My grass is a little bit patchy. It feels like a poor ball in his head. Springy hairs kind of poking up everywhere. But that's also in the terms of the mapping. So the better the map is, the tighter the map is, the denser that atmosphere will become, right? So now the other thing that I kind of failed to mention in this is that inside of this map that we built for the fur, right? You can actually go ahead and scroll down on there and you can add a material to that fur. So if we wanted the grass to be fluorescent plastic green, do that, right? Or there's actually like hair, like literal hair files in here. So if you want it to look like hair, you can do that. So during 325, last year, we made mice, and we rendered out little like cartoon looking mice with furry bodies. So Sarah Castillo, if you know one, had little like black button eyes, and it was all pumping around, and it had this cute little nose, and it had this big bushy fur, right? But that's the thing, is that's what we're capable of. That's what we make inside of these tools, and that's what's good to know is that your imagination isn't only to architecture, but it's beyond, right? How else can I use this thing, and what else does it look like?
It doesn't do gravity, right?
It does.
It does.
Yes. So I can turn gravity onto here on the fur, and I can turn up the gravity, turn it down. So I'll actually pull it down in certain ways. Awesome. Yeah. So like it'll pull and adjust the surfaces. So like if you have like hair, if you have a person, right, you can make sure that it looks like their hair's following or blowing the wind. Yeah. But come on, little guy, you can do this.
And those all have to be like from VRAY or we upload.
You can upload your own material maps in there too. Yeah. So you can build your own material maps. You can actually create your own materials inside of the asset editor. So here at the bottom of this, when you're in materials, you can just click on this, and this is a whole list of things that you can make. So it'll give you basic things. You can have two-sided material, single-sided. Here's your hair right there, right? So you can actually just create a new thing of hair, right? Car paints, two-sided materials is like when you have material on one side and then the other. So say you have a film on a glass, you want the glass to change color when you turn at it. You can do one side is one color and one side is clear. And then as you look at it differently, because the light will refract to change the color of the glass. You can have things like emissive materials. So those are materials that glow. You can also have other geometries. So lights, textures. So this is tile, like your UV maps or your splatter, or you can add smoke or fog into your modeling. Rendered elements, those are some of the Z-depths and the texture and the raw images. Now, the other thing that this tool does give you, and we'll look at it now, we got about 6 more buckets to finish, is that when we export our files, we can actually export them with all of these other maps involved. So each part of the scene is built with a certain materiality to it, okay? But just in talking about, we talked a little bit about entourage and really quickly, you can see like when we first rendered it, how lifeless it became, right? But adding trees and people walking through the scene, it just adds another depth. It makes it feel like it has a little bit of life to it. But when you export the file out beyond just a PNG file, you can also export out texture maps and light maps, which gives you the chance to replace them in Photoshop really, really simply. So now that it's finished, what I can do now is I can just come up here. A couple of things. First is that you also have layering that happens inside of this model as well. So if I turn off my denoiser, you can see it'll adjust the denoise. I can also add things like exposure to it, just like you do in Photoshop. So I can turn up the exposure or turn down the exposure. Maybe make it moody, angry dandelions. I can also add other pieces in there, things like I can add in a background if I want and put in a background image. And so I can find an image from a file that I have, or I can, I can go into like, just go download one really quick. Oops. Those are a little too crazy. So we can grab like something like that. Let's find a free one. We like free more than we like. Blue sky texture map. Save image as. I'm just gonna throw it onto my desktop here. Okay, now I have a virus, so that's great. I'm gonna go back to here. I can now go into my desktop, find that image of the blue sky right there, open it, and it's gonna put that map out in the background. That's kind of funky because of the tree, but we can actually adjust some of those pieces as a background too, but you don't have to use the background either. But let me show you how it happens when you export that file. So if I now go to save, I can save that file out, okay? And I can save it out as a PNG, so I can put it whatever I want to call it. Final. That's what you guys' favorite title for projects are. I know, I get them a lot. Final. The last one, honest. Truthfully, I don't want to do this anymore. Now you can save all image channels as separate files. Okay, this is what I wanted to show you. So I can come here, I'm gonna make a folder. And the channel files are going to be really, really helpful. So do that one again, final. Okay, and let me show you what those look like. So now that you have them, I can come back into that folder. Here's my little VRAY folder here. And here's the alpha graphic. So this is just the white balance of the image. That's the actual image itself. Okay, that's the end result. And there's the noiser. Where's my material map? File. Save current. There's actually material map. Where are you? Denoiser, alpha, denoiser, RGB, noise level, focus mount, world normals. Okay, there we go. World positions. So this file right here, these position files are actually really, really helpful as you move out, because what this actually gives you is that this gives you depth maps. So you can actually add depth and texture to your materials. It also gives you things to select to, so that if you want to go ahead and it's not even my alpha, my RGB maps. So my material image outputs, but you can actually get it to Switch to alpha graphics, monochromatic pixel aspect options, settings. Yep. All right. I'm not sure why, but these are the parts and pieces that you can get out of the file so that you can actually go in and back and bring those into Photoshop to adjust your layering inside of your models and your pieces to that. So any questions? It was like mad dash. That makes sense? Okay. So what I tell you guys to do is the best thing to get used to this is just to like jump in there, right? Sounds crazy, but get in, get your feet wet, play with some of these things, see how they work, and use whatever tool you have, right? If you use SketchUp, use SketchUp. All of these things are exactly the same, whether it's SketchUp, Revit, or Rhino. But I would say that this is one of those tools I use in final rendering specifically. The next thing I would do is bring it into Photoshop and then start adding some Photoshop layers on top. So like a background, I'd add lens flares and color tones and wash it out a little bit. And that way you get that layering of materiality and that depth of field that you like. So I tend to be a person that has very ethereal effect renderings. They're like not photorealistic. They're kind of like, I start photorealistic and then they start to look kind of more experiential. That's my style. That's who I am as a designer. And so it fits really well in that regard. So each person's different, right? Find your style as you work and you'll find what works for you. So awesome. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much.